Okay, I'm going to talk about price elasticity of demand. It is a huge part of microeconomics. It's a huge part of economics in general. Elasticity is because it deals with the essentially the slope and why demand curves and also supply curves, but in this case demand curves, are more sloped than others. We're going to get into the determinants of why that happens, but it's really important to understand because the slope of the demand curve is going to tell us a lot about the nature of the product, and by extension, it tells us a lot about our behavior. Remember, these demand curves are just symbols of our representations of our behavior put in mathematical graphical form. So the slope of those, the severity of that behavior changes with different outside forces. And we need to understand that because that gives us a lot of idea about why we behave the way that we do, and then why we consume more things than others and how that will change with price. So you can see price elasticity of demand. It's the measurement of how quantity changes due to a change in price. Okay? So the measurement of how Q changes due to a change in P. Okay? So we're going to look at that in a couple different ways. Essentially, you measure that as if we're looking for, there's a whole bunch of formulas. This is the most basic of them. We're going to do some total revenue ways to figure out elasticity. There's also a midpoint way that's a little bit much for some students, so we're not going to worry about that. So you just take the percent change in quantity over the percent change in price. If that number, when you figure these two things out, is greater than 1, the good is elastic, which means, and I'll get to what that means in a second. If it's less than 1, it's inelastic. If it's 1, if the percent change in quantity is the same as the percent change in price, then we say the good is unit elastic, right? So let's talk about what this means. There are two graphs up here. There are graph A and graph B. Graph A is inelastic, which means the percent change in price is greater than percent change in quantity, which means, let's look at what that means in general terms, okay? If here's our price equilibrium and here's our quantity equilibrium, we can have, we'll say it goes down to P sub 1. That's a pretty decent sized change in price, but you can see when we go over to the demand curve, the change in quantity demanded is very small. So you have a large change in price that leads to a pretty small change in quantity demand. And if you raise the price, we'll say to P sub 2, okay, well we might demand a little bit less, but we're not demanding all that much less. Again, a pretty significant change in price leads to a pretty insignificant change in quantity demanded. And there are lots of reasons for that, which we'll see in another video, but this is what inelastic looks like. You can also have what we call perfectly inelastic. A perfectly inelastic curve is literally vertical, okay? But what we call a relatively inelastic curve, which is what demand curve D is here on graph A, you can see that the percent change in price is going to be much larger than the smaller percent change in quantity. But inelastic demand curve means that we are much more likely to keep consuming regardless of a change in price. And there are reasons for that, which another video we'll get to. Let's look at the elastic curve over here. This is when the percent change in quantity is greater than percent change in price. So let's say that let's say we raise the price up to P sub 1. Well, it hits this demand curve right here. Here's Q sub 1. So you can see here, not that big a change in price percent-wise compared to the change in quantity demanded, right? So you can see the change in quantity demanded is really high. If we lower the price, though, we'll say to P sub 2, about the same as the change in price here. We barely had a change in quantity here. You can see we go all the way here. And again, we have a giant change in quantity demanded with a relatively smaller percent change in price. There are reasons why demand curves are more elastic. The more horizontal they are, the more elastic they are. The more vertical they are, the more inelastic. And there are reasons we'll get to in another video. But this does, again, symbolize our behavior under certain conditions. And there are certain products that are much more likely to have an elastic demand curve. A perfectly elastic demand curve is completely horizontal, okay? Where a perfectly inelastic demand curve is completely vertical. So this is the basis of what elasticity is. And then the videos moving forward will talk about why we are elastic or more inelastic. But it's very, very important to understanding the idea of our behavior and how our conditions of scarcity are more severe with some products rather than other products based on our needs and wants and desires.